It's time we talked about Black Lives Matter. As I would hope you are aware, there are a lot of protests going on at the moment, and I think this is very important to talk about. And as a person with a platform, I feel it is a necessity that I at least make an effort to use this platform in the fight to dismantle racism. As someone who, in case you hadn't noticed, isn't black, I can't tell you about what it's like to be black, because, well, I'm not black. But what I can do is talk about history and hopefully educate people. It's kind of my thing, talking about history and educating them on it. So, this is a very brief history of racism against black people in the UK since 1950. That might sound like a very specific title, but this is a very vast topic, and even then I'm going to struggle to fit everything in. It's going to be very much shortened down, but hopefully this should provide some form of a springboard so that you can go and research further into these topics and things that you're like, I would like to know more about that. Just before we get into this, I want to put some kind of warning just to say that, unsurprisingly, this video is going to get into some rather unsavoury topics. We begin with the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948. I know I said this begins in 1950, but this is kind of important. A boat that sailed from Jamaica to London carrying 492 migrant workers who were seeking a life in Britain. And they'd been invited over by the British government. The subsequent wave of immigrants that followed from the new Commonwealth, that is, countries in the Commonwealth where the majority of people are people of colour, was known as the Windrush Generation. Bear that one in mind for the very end of the video, we'll be coming back to that. In 1958, over 210,000 immigrants from the new Commonwealth had settled in Britain, with most of them coming from the West Indies, but also from India and Pakistan. In Britain, there were mixed attitudes to this, with some having fears of being overwhelmed with people that have skin that looks slightly different to their own. The arrival of these people brought the beginnings of social change and also a rise in racial tensions. It is important to note that whilst many people were arriving in the country, loads of Brits were emigrating, particularly to Australia, and Britain was having a net loss of people due to migration. The racial tension really became apparent in August 1958 when gangs of white youths began to go out after pub brawls on what they called... You can read. I'm not going to say that word. At the end of August, there were outbreaks of violence in Notting Hill, an area with a large concentration of people from the Caribbean. This violence was started by mostly white youths attacking West Indians, and then later there was some violence in the other direction. The police did a terrible job at dealing with this, as they were unprepared, and as a result, the riot caused tension between the Met Police and the British African Caribbean community, who believed that the police had not taken their reports of racial attacks seriously. In 2002, it was revealed that the senior police officers at the time had assured the Home Secretary that there was little or no racial motivation behind the disturbance, despite individual testimony from police officers saying the exact opposite. It also pays to mention that in 1959, the British Union of Fascists under the grotesque Oswald Mosley was still a thing and standing for election. A party that openly called itself fascist. Yeah, enough said. In 1962, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act was passed, bringing in immigration control, and despite Labour's strong opposition to it, they didn't repeal it when they came into power 2 years later. Suspicious. Before we move properly into the 60s, however, we need to talk about decolonisation. In 1947, Britain had withdrawn from India, facing national independence movements from several of its colonies. Their strategy initially had been to gradually transition from Empire to Commonwealth until the peoples were ready for independence. Yeah, the Empire was still a thing really not that long ago. The Mau Mau Uprising, which had begun in 1952, is also important to mention. It was a violent nationalist uprising against British rule in Kenya by a group who were accused of committing atrocities. However, the catch here is that the British authorities also committed atrocities and war crimes, despite being the ones with the power. I really don't want to list the things that the British government got up to because I read very briefly and they're really, really disturbing. But to put it shortly, maiming, massacres, torture, forced labour, brutal interrogation and rape. Back to the British Isles, and racial tensions in Britain continued throughout the 60s. A survey in North London showed that 1 in 5 people objected to working with black people or Asians. Half said they would refuse to live next to a black person, and 9 out of 10 people disapproved of mixed marriages. Yeah, it's not a good look. In 1965, the government passed the first Race Relations Act to try and help deal with this. The act forbade discrimination in public on the grounds of colour, race, or ethnic or national origins. However, it left it okay to discriminate in housing and employment. Moreover, complaints of discrimination were to be referred to the Race Relations Board, a board which couldn't compel witnesses to attend hearings, and was thus hugely ineffective. In the first year, the board handled 982 complaints, 734 of which were dismissed due to lack of evidence. I think this half-assed attempt at preventing discrimination says a lot. 3 years later, in 1968, the government then passed a second Race Relations Act, which finally banned discrimination in housing, employment, and also insurance and other services, as well as increasing the power of the Race Relations Board. Loopholes, however, remained, and the board only upheld 10% of the complaints it received to 1972. To rub it in, the same year the government also passed a second Immigration Act, which limited the right of return to Britain for non-white Commonwealth citizens. 1968 was also the year of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. For the uninitiated, Enoch Powell was a massive racist, and the Rivers of Blood speech was a really racist speech that focused in particular on mass immigration. The opposition leader sacked him from the shadow cabinet and never spoke to him again. However, a Gallup poll found that 75% of the population supported what Powell had said, and there were strikes by dockers and meat porters in London, and a protest march to Downing Street in response to the sacking. So clearly, Britain was still rather racist in the late 1960s. In 1971, another Immigration Act was passed, further restricting the right of people from the new Commonwealth to come to Britain. By 1974, over 1 million new Commonwealth immigrants had arrived in the country, with these people tending to settle in the same areas where there were already cultural and family networks. In spite of this, the political representation in these areas remained limited. For instance, in 1974, the London Borough Council elections elected only 10 non-white councillors, which went up to 35 in 1978, but in neither case did this represent the size of the non-white population. In 1976, yet another Race Relations Act was passed, this one establishing a Commission for Racial Equality, which actually had the power to investigate and compel witnesses to appear in front of it. In that same year, 1976, only 70 Metropolitan Police officers were people of colour, out of 22,000. Young black people felt harassed by the police, and these tensions were very apparent. That year, the hostility erupted at the Notting Hill Carnival into a riot where over 300 people were injured, and as a result there were calls to ban the event. Also by this year, the National Front had around 20,000 members. The National Front was a fascist, extremely racist, I mean that's kind of part of being fascist, political party, who had a tendency to violently attack people who weren't white. They'd become very active in parts of London, such as Brick Lane and Southall, where immigrants had settled, and by 1977 the National Front were being described as Britain's fourth largest political party. In the late 70s, the Tories announced they would toughen up immigration policy even further, and Thatcher said she received hundreds of letters in support, and the party gained an 11-point lead in the polls following it. 1978 may have seemed like a year of progress, with Viv Anderson becoming the first black player to be picked for the England team. However, football remained rife with racism, as fans would make monkey noises and throw banana skins at black players. Likewise, comedians still felt able to make racist jokes. The black and white minstrel show, in which actors blacked up, continued to be made until this year. Suspicions with regard to the police were highlighted in 1979 with the death of Blair Peach. Peach was a teacher and anti-Nazi League activist who was killed when a demonstration was blocked by police. Allegedly, he was struck on the head by a police truncheon, and in 2010 the Met Police admitted responsibility for his death. By 1980, the Commission for Racial Equality was warning racial prejudice is still rife, and so is racial discrimination, while the response of the government has been disappointingly inadequate. For some context for the 1980s, this decade saw economic realignment which led to decay in inner cities, young people no longer being able to expect to follow their parents into work, and the increase of the north-south divide, which is the economic divide between the north and south of the UK, where the south of the country is significantly better off. In 1981, there were riots between April and June in Brixton, London, Handsworth in Birmingham, Toxteth in Liverpool, and Chapelton, Leeds. These were areas in which had suffered high levels of unemployment and deprivation. The Scarman Report was commissioned to examine the causes of the riot, and it identified race and poverty as key components. Another important part was the Sus Law, which gave police permission to stop and search people they suspected might commit a crime. Ethnic minorities believed that the police unfairly targeted them with this rule. Not long before the Brixton riots, Operation Swamp, which aimed to reduce street crime, had stopped 1,000 people in 6 days. The Sus Law was repealed later that year. In 1985, there were further riots in Brixton, which were sparked when the Met Police shot Dorothy Gross. They had raided her home as they believed her son, who was suspected of robbery and a firearms offence, was hiding in her home. He wasn't. And it took the police until 2014 to apologise for this. The subsequent riots led to the death of a photojournalist and the injury of 43 civilians and 10 police officers. Whilst cordoning off the local police station, the police reportedly made several unprovoked attacks on passers-by and accredited members of the media. 1987 saw 4 non-white MPs elected, the first since the 1920s, and all 4 held their seats in the 1992 election. However, in 1992, John Taylor, a black Tory candidate, lost to the Lib Dems amid rumours of racism from his own party in the local area. The 1990s saw a sharp increase in the number of asylum seekers fleeing from violence in places such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. Migration also continued from the new Commonwealth. Many of these were Muslim, and this is where we begin to see the boom of Islamophobia, which has become rather prevalent today. However, this video is already as long enough as it is, and said topic deserves a separate video. 1993 saw the murder of Stephen Lawrence, a black A-level student who was killed by a gang of white youths at a bus stop in southeast London. The identity of the youths was believed to have been known to the Crown Prosecution Service, but it was decided there wasn't enough evidence to convict them. The actions of the police were widely criticised for failing to investigate the case properly and for assuming that a black teenager was likely to have been the perpetrator rather than the victim. After failing to get any convictions in a private prosecution, Stephen's parents continued to campaign for justice. Following a campaign in the Daily Mail in 1998, the government ordered a public inquiry into the case chaired by a High Court judge. The subsequent MacPherson Report concluded that the Metropolitan Police, while not corrupt, had been incompetent and was institutionally racist. In 2001, the BBC chairman acknowledged that his workforce was hideously white, believing that his organisation didn't do enough to attract and retain people from ethnic minorities. The expansion of the EU in the early 2000s allowed for people from Central and Eastern Europe to move to Britain. In 2001, opinion polls had found that immigration was regarded as a vital issue by only 3% of voters. By 2007, this number had reached nearly 30%. During the noughties, the British National Party, BNP, a fascist party that is still around today, held over 50 seats in local government, as well as 1 seat on the London Assembly and 2 members of European Parliament. This is a party who believed that only white people can be British and should be allowed to live here, and they were able to, literally only a decade ago, become the most successful far-right party in British history. Tell me this country doesn't have a problem with racism again? 2011 saw the London riots. On the 4th of August, Mark Duggan was shot dead by police. Duggan had been pulled over as part of an intelligence-led operation to investigate gun crime in the black community. The media widely reported that a bullet was found embedded in a police radio, implying Duggan had fired on police, but friends and family of him say that he was unarmed. The IPCC later stated that a pistol was recovered from the scene, but it had been wrapped in a sock and there was no evidence that it had been fired. The bullet in the police radio had been one that had passed through Duggan's body. Note that an inquest in 2014 found him to have been lawfully killed, and this was upheld in the Court of Appeal in 2017. A peaceful march to demand justice 2 days later became rioting and looting. By the 10th, there had been over 3,000 arrests and 16 people were injured, as well as 5 people killed. In June 2015, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police admitted that there was some justification in claims that the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist. In June 2016, pro-Remain Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered by a man who reportedly shouted "Britain First" as he carried out his attack. Britain First was another one of those fascist fringe political parties that Britain seems to be unable to shake. National Action, yet another fascist party, who had been founded in 2013, praised the murder of Joe Cox. This led to them being prescribed a terrorist organisation in December 2016, making them the first far-right to be prescribed as such since World War II. Yes, it took until 4 years ago for one of those parties that actively opposed the rights of my fellow countrymen who have different skin colours to exist, to be outlawed. June 2017 was when Grenfell happened, and I'm sure you know about that. It was the deadliest structural fire in the country since 1988, causing 72 deaths, which spread because of the use of cheap cladding on the tower block that didn't meet building regulations. The tower was located in the Kensington and Chelsea borough, one of the wealthiest local authorities in the country, and the council had amassed £274 million of reserves, which it had used to pay top-rate council taxpayers a £100 rebate shortly before local elections. So it's not as if they couldn't have afforded some fire-resistant cladding. The tower was populated mainly by poorer and ethnic minority residents, and just to rub it in, some of the former residents of the tower even had rent payment taken out of their bank accounts after the event by the council. Do you remember the Windrush Generation, who we talked about at the very start of this video? Well, in 2018, in at least 83 cases, people were found to have been wrongly detained, denied legal rights, and threatened with deportation by the Home Office in what became known as the Windrush Scandal. Many of these people had been part of the Windrush Generation, and as well as those deported, an unknown number were detained with a number of long-term UK residents being refused re-entry into the UK. The statistics from the Home Office and Ministry of Justice show that in 2018 to 19, black people were more than 9 times as likely to be stopped and searched by police as white people. They were over 3 times as likely to be arrested, 5 times as likely to have force used against them, and that a quarter of the population in prisons comes from a black and minority ethnic group background, despite representing just 14% of the population. This number rises to 50% in young offenders institutions. So that takes us up to today. That was a lot, and not the most fun of things to learn about, but it's important. Hopefully, if anyone now tries to tell you that the UK is not racist and that racism here in the UK is over, then you're in a better position to refute them and educate them on why they're wrong. And to have that conversation. If you're white, you're in an excellent position to educate fellow white people on issues of race, as much as it shouldn't be this way, white people find it a lot easier to listen to other white people. So hopefully this is something you can use to your advantage to do good, rather than to do damage. So really, that's my call to action. Please, if you're white, then go and have some conversations with other white people about issues of race and try and educate other white people on racism and kind of point them to the right places and resources. And also, when you have family members or friends or just other people you know, call them out when they say things that aren't okay to say. If you're not white, then it's not my place to tell you about your own experiences, so you don't have to do the homework. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that, but also, more importantly, I am going to leave some links to some interesting videos that I find on topics so that you have just some more resources to go and learn a bit more about race, etc. in the description and in the corner and basically all the places you can put links. And yeah, take care, look after your fellow humans. Wesath ye holla.